Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, June 9th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. If you would like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Joseph Lamore, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. So what's on deck for this week? Well, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Lisa S. Gardiner. She is a geoscientist, an educator, and of course, a science writer. And she has a new book out called Reefs of Time: What Fossils Reveal About Coral Survival. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Lisa Gardiner. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here.
I'm excited to talk about your new book, Reefs of Time: What Fossils Reveal About Coral Survival. So I think that this is a topic that I've touched up, maybe brushed up against on the show before, kind of talked in different ways with like maybe one or two scientists in the past, more like ocean acidification, modern stuff. And then I've done a little bit of talk. I remember having a scientist on the show who studied like fossilized shark teeth and sort of what that can help us understand about climate change. So, around this topic, but not directly at this topic. But before we even get into the book itself and what you wanted to highlight in the book, I would like to learn a little more about you. So would you consider yourself a science writer first and foremost? Would you consider yourself a scientist first and foremost? Kind of half-half?
Yeah, do I have to pick one?
Right.
I think I'm kind of a blend of different types of things. I mean, I'm a scientist by training, and I tend to put on my scientist hat quite often. But I'm also a science writer and communicator, and so I'm not an active researcher at this time. I'm more focused on helping the public, helping students, teachers, all sorts of people understand science, and particularly the science of the environment and what's going on with our current environmental catastrophe and how we can help.
So tell me a little bit about your training then, your training as a scientist. Like, what did you study in school? What kind of research questions were you trying to answer when you were still a student?
So let's go way back. Let's go because I want to give a shout out to all those kids out there who think science is dumb, because I was one of those too. And I was not one of those kids that just loved science and saw themselves having a scientific career. In fact, I didn't really know what that was, but I really loved nature as a kid, and I did not get the connection between nature and science at that time. But in college, I took an intro geology course and realized that connection between nature and science, and also realized that geology was all about history, not necessarily human history, but much deeper in time. And that was just so fascinating. So that really changed everything for me. So my training as a scientist, my PhD is in geology with a focus on paleoecology. So that's not just fossils, but what all the fossils in an area can tell us about an ancient ecosystem. It's more stories from the past, really. And in more recent years, I've broadened out to more Earth system science, how our planet is sort of interconnected in lots of different ways. But I've always been interested in the arts too. And I think that then helped me gravitate towards science communication and science education and these ways of sharing science, because you can get really creative, as I think you know. After grad school, I went into science education and science communication. But while I was in grad school, my dissertation project really focused on fossil reefs on the edges of these tropical islands in the Bahamas. And this was amazing to me. These reefs lived at a time about 120,000 years ago, before humans were causing messes on the planet. And I mean, if it's strange to see a coral reef that is completely without, you know, the current catastrophes happening right now to coral reefs. And of course, a fossil coral reef, everything is dead. That's just the way it is. These animals lived and died 120,000 years ago, but you could see how the ecosystem was put together from the fossils, and I just was so fascinated by that. And at the same time, the reefs just offshore, the living ones, they were in terrible state. The situation was growing worse, and so it was tough to see the present day ecosystem floundering, while the past was looking healthy, aside from the fact that it was dead. I think that kind of became the nucleus of this book, although I carried that nucleus around for years and years, wondering what to do with it. Um, and uh, and yeah, but after grad school, I think, probably because of that experience of seeing modern ecosystems, modern reefs, floundering, I realized that there was this huge need to help people learn about the environment and how the environment was changing, and also what we can do about it. And so that was something that I felt like I could really contribute to.
I'm curious about that change, kind of that transition that a lot of people who work in science communication go through, where they sort of discover public communication of science, sometimes during their training, sometimes after their training. Did you do any, like, formal education in science communication and science writing? Did you come to it through colleagues? Like, how did you sort of make that leap?
While I was in grad school, I was at doing my PhD at University of Georgia, and there was a group of us that did a program called EcoReach. So this was a project led by grad students to bring environmental science into Georgia public schools. And we were all rather self-taught in different ways. I had worked as an environmental educator before grad school, while I was an undergrad, and I worked for the the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and so I had some background in this, but definitely more or less self-taught. But at the time, Georgia schools were really having trouble with science education. And so this was a very welcome thing in a lot of classrooms, that a bunch of ecology and geology grad students would come in and lead programs for free. That was something I did. And there was a natural history museum there too. So I worked on some exhibits. So I feel like I found opportunities, much like grad students do all over the place. I'm not unique in this, but found opportunities to share my science, but then also share science in general, and generate some excitement and enthusiasm for these sorts of things. And then making that pivot, I was told at the time, like, oh no, you're going to shut yourself out of academia by going towards communication, psychom, and science education. But I landed at an education group associated with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. This is a group called the UCAR Center for Science Education, and it really works to help bring that academic science to various audiences, to the general public, to K-12 students, to their teachers. And I think that was a very wonderful place for me to kind of work between these groups, so that academic science doesn't just stay in academia, it's more broadly spread.
Yeah, and I mean, thinking of that translation of academic science, it's curious that I often see this evolution with scientists. I shouldn't say scientists turned science writers, but scientists who are also science writers or science communicators who have written full length trade publications where their first book is something, a topic of interest that they have maybe done a lot of writing about, like their editors have asked them to write about a lot for different, freelance outlets, or they've, yeah, lived in a series of essays and it's interesting to them, or there's a topic that between a editor and a writer feels like, okay, this is going to be an interesting book. Let's work on this. And then their second book is often like that thing that they've been carrying with them since grad school, like whatever their dissertation research was, where they're like, I
Yeah.
haven't been able to figure out how to make this work, but I've been sitting on it now for like 5, 10, 15 years. Okay, I feel like I'm
Yeah.
ready to write this because that's so near and dear to your heart, right?
Well, I
This book
think,
that we're talking about
yeah,
today.
yeah, I mean, it's something, I think one of my favorite things about other people's books is when there's a sort of paradox that's being explored. And in this book, I was carrying around that little nugget because there was this paradox that over hundreds of thousands of years, coral reefs have come back again and again as sea level has changed, as situations have changed, they've popped back up. And so they seem really resilient. And yet we look at them in the current problems and it's like, no, they're incredibly vulnerable. And I think there's something about this, like, how can you be both very vulnerable and very resilient, that was a book. It wasn't just some, straightforward article. It required a more in-depth explanation. But I did write that first book that I wrote that came out in 2018, Tales from an Uncertain World, was really based on my experience as a climate educator, that I had seen people kind of struggle with, like, okay, so this is a catastrophe. What do we do? And I thought, well, there's other catastrophes we've dealt with, and I wanted to explore that. And that's actually it was born in my MFA thesis. So I
Oh, real? Oh,
um,
interesting. So that came even before.
yeah. So, well, no, my MFA
Oh,
was
you
after my
You did
PhD.
your
So
MFA after your
I'm
PhD. I love that so much.
so
You're one
yeah,
of them. You're one of them. You can never leave school. I know
I
many of you.
know. Yeah. Every 7 to 10 years, I'll be back in
Yeah.
school. Who knows what it'll be next time? But yeah.
Was your
So
MFA in, was it in writing? What art
yes.
was okay, okay,
Yeah. So
cool.
master's fine art in nonfiction writing. And this, about 7 to 10 years after, oh no, maybe less, after I started the science education work. And my variety of science education was not with a classroom full of students. It was developing educational websites and curriculum and writing text and illustrations for museum exhibits. So it was a lot of writing work. And I really wanted to learn more about storytelling because people learn through stories. And this was not an area I had a lot of formal training in. So I took some creative nonfiction writing workshops and an environmental journalism course, and those were all great, but I wanted to go a bit deeper. So I earned an MFA in nonfiction writing from Goucher College, which has a really innovative program that attracts those people that, you know, years after their PhD want to do something different with it. So I was in good company there, but that got me started on the idea of books, which can seem pretty intimidating if you haven't written one. But in
For
that
sure.
case, you had to write a book for your thesis. And it wasn't exactly what was published. I mean, that was several years after I completed my degree that it turned into an actual book. But that got me really excited about these kind of longer form stories and how you can kind of take people on an adventure. Well, take myself on an adventure, I guess, but
Mhm.
and communicate it to other people, but sort of, not just a short article that crams a lot of information into a short space, but taking time to really process and think about what's going on. And I really loved that.
For sure. I think that I feel the same way. I mean, I know it's a wildly different format, but I worked in television for 10, 15 years. Several years into my TV career, I started podcasting, and it offered or afforded me, I guess, a similar but like kind of microcosm of that, where I could go away from that. Okay, we've got to cram everything in these perfect sound bites and kind of dump out before the commercial break to, oh, we've got an hour to just have a real conversation about this. And if there's a story, if there's nuance, if there's a parallel, oh, that reminds me of this, or here's a metaphor, like being able to really delve into that in a way that feels organic. It's more like real life. It's more like how we communicate to each other in our everyday lives.
And we don't get like a fire hose of information at all times. It's like there's information and then there's some processing that goes on, some thoughtful reflection and some, like you have to make sense of the world. And I think that sort of longer format, I mean, you can do different things in different formats.
Yeah.
I love television. Like, there's all sorts of different
Same. Yeah.
reasons
Mhm.
to change formats and try different things. But yeah, there's just a kind of a longer and more involved expedition you can take in a book than in a short article or a web page that someone's going to look at on their phone for 20 seconds before leaving. So
Yeah.
it was it's really wonderful to kind of expand out that way.
I love that. It's also a different kind of audience, I think, and, I mean, historically, we all were well, not all, obviously, there were always literacy problems, but, like, historically, books were a medium that I think we're engaged with at kind of a larger frequency, and it is troubling to me. It's actually, this is something I've never really talked about on the show, so sorry to bring it up on
Oh, that's
your
okay.
interview.
Go for
Like, "You
it.
got a new book out, people buy the book," and I'm like, "People don't read." But
Wait,
there is
everyone read.
yeah, exactly. Like, I attempt to read every night. This is, like, just important for my sleep hygiene, and it's important for my own personal development and also just my creativity and my engagement with the world and my curiosity. I like to have a book at my bedside. I usually have, like, 3 or 4 books that I'm reading, but, I like to have a book at my bedside. I like to dedicate 1 to 2 chapters a night to that book to be able to sit with it before I sleep, and I don't know, I think I'm better for it. I like to have read. I like to actively read because I'm curious about it and it's interesting, and I also like to have read. I like to share the things I've learned. I like to compare that information to other information. I read differently than many. I remember dating someone once, and I looked over, while they were reading in bed, and they had a pen and were underlining things and taking notes in the back, and I was like, "Mm, I don't
Yeah.
do that." And my MO is the more I absorb, the more that sort of everything goes through the spin cycle and comes out in the wash. Like, I'm always
Mhm,
comparing notes in my head, and the things that feel salient stick. The things that really are engaging and relevant are gonna be there
mhm.
for a long time, and the small
Yeah,
details that may fall back out of my brain, that's okay. That's how it is to engage with life.
I agree. And I think that, different bits of a book will do that for different people. And so, what immediately caught on to you, the next paragraph might be something that someone else would really resonate with. And the other thing you mentioned about reading before bed, I find, reading a piece of a book before bed is really because my mind kind of expands while I sleep. And, so I wake up in the morning with I don't know, just a more thoughtful kind of way of wondering about the world. And when it's a piece of a book, it's not a complete story. So you didn't you didn't have a beginning, middle, and end, to there's sort of this piece of a story that makes me wonder about, other sorts of things. So I love that about books. I also recognize there's many other forms of media that are incredibly wonderful, and we're at this time when there's a whole diversity of different different types of media. And so I don't mean to discount any of the others. The books are not the only way, but I do think for the type of story where you need to explore things deeply, I really hope that, for everyone, a book comes to mind, because that sort of in-depth explanation, or adventure, or kind of just inquiry is not something that you could necessarily do in a paragraph or a short news piece, or, well, maybe.
I think there's pretty good evidence to support the fact that reading the words on the page, hearing them if you have an inner voice, some people don't have an inner voice, but hearing them in your inner voice, and if you also don't have aphantasia, constructing imagery in your mind while you are reading is very good practice. It's very good for mental agility, for cognitive flexibility, for creativity, for engaging with the world. And just to add to that, what you mentioned about reading at night, because I never really thought about it, but it makes so much sense. So many people late at night, this is when all the skeletons come out. This is when the anxieties start to come. This is when people start to spiral, and the insomnia and the just kind of discomfort. And when we read at night before we sleep, it's not like we're distracting ourselves, but we're offering that sort of nervous energy a place of engagement. We're giving ourselves permission to use that reflective time where a lot of existential and kind of hard stuff comes up in those quiet moments. And we're doing it in a way that has at least a little bit of structure, kind of something to hold on to, which I think can be very mooring for a lot of people. But they forget. We forget, right? And then we go, "Oh, I'm just lying here and this is so uncomfortable." It's like, pick up a book. Come on. Like, trust me, it's gonna help.
Yeah. I call that time of night the what if time.
There you
It's just full of what ifs.
Absolutely. I wonder how much that what if time was, for the author, right? And the artist, the process of the what if time. But I'd love to sort of, turn back to Reefs of Time, because there are just so many technical questions that I want to get out of the way just to understand even how you approach this kind of research and this kind of writing. So, when I think of coral, I think of the structure, this like kind of scaffolding or this skeleton, this like calcium carbonate. Is that what it's made out of? The skeleton, and then it's really the living organisms that are sort of embodying the soft parts that most people don't think of as soft, but they are. And these corals are alive not just as these complex organisms, but also as like full ecosystems. So my confusion, I guess, about a coral fossil is it just dead coral? Is it just the calcium carbonate? Or do they fossilize the way we think of traditional fossils? Like, are these actually turning to stone? Are they new deposits in place of where that coral reef was?
It's a very good question, because especially since Reefs of Time focuses on what I like to call the shallow end of deep time. So this is, the Earth is nearly 4.6 billion years old. This book just looks at the last couple 100,000 years. And
So
so,
people have been around for the last couple 100,000 years, like
yes,
in their
yeah,
modern form, right? Like Homo sapiens at least has
the
been around.
species, yes,
Yeah, yeah.
but in much smaller numbers. There were a lot fewer of us, but there was a lot of coral, and I think it in this case I faced some like, wait a minute, what is a fossil? Because there are people who study the remains of reefs, so the corals and all sorts of other, shells and things that are preserved within reefs that are a couple 100 years old, or a couple 1,000 years old, or 10,000 years old. And, the reefs I was looking at, I considered them fully fossilized at 120,000 years old. And so, when exactly does a fossil form? There isn't a specific date. These are all, I mean, usually we consider fossils to be within rock. And so, how long does it take for rock to form? And in the tropics, in these places where reefs form, and calcium carbonate is basically limestone. That's the mineral that forms limestone, and so limestone forms very quickly in the tropics. And so you can find on a tropical beach, sand grains all cemented together into rock that maybe just has been around for a couple hundred years or maybe less. Compared to how rocks form in other settings, like if the Mississippi River is carrying a whole bunch of sediment, it's not going to be bound together into a rock in a couple hundred years. It takes much longer. The rocks form themselves much more rapidly, but there's this sort of gray area between a dead coral skeleton and a coral fossil. And there's this wonderful term called subfossils for these skeletons that have been around so long that, a few thousand years, but they're not fully fossilized yet. They haven't gotten a lot of extra mineral, precipitated inside of them. Attached within solid rock. We could think of subfossils as kind of like the counselors in training of the fossil world, that they eventually could become fossils unless they're ground apart and eroded away. The coral animals, kind of going back to your original, what is coral and all that. It's I think, this is one reason I wanted to write this book too, is that coral itself is just incredible, but I think it's totally underappreciated. The corals are animals. They're animals without backbones, so invertebrates. They have only one end to their digestive tract. So I used to tell college students when I taught at University of Georgia that their mouth and their anus were the same thing, and I'd get this room full of completely disgusted looks. And so they're simple. They appear pretty simple, and yet they're incredibly complex and even powerful. An individual coral animal is tiny. It's often smaller than an eraser at the end of a pencil, like that little tiny guys. But they live in colonies. Most corals are colonial. And together in colonies, thousands and thousands of these little coral individual animals called polyps, they build these huge structures of calcium carbonate, of limestone. And those structures that they create become habitat for all sorts of other life. I think it's estimated as about a quarter of all life in the ocean needs coral reefs for at least some part of its lifespan. So this structure, if you pictured a typical seafloor, it's sandy and flat, and the structure that creates all these little nooks and crannies, all these areas where other animals can find habitat. And coral has, you know, this very small, humble kind of beginnings, but they create these enormous structures that are so important, and not just habitat for the marine life, but for shallow reefs, it protects our coastlines. So coastal communities are protected by reefs. There's all sorts of other things that we're just learning, like coral colonies have incredibly complex microbiomes, and we're just starting to understand that. So not only are there all the clones in a colony, all the clones of the corals, but in each one of those, there's just all these other microbes that are kind of part of the system. So they are incredible. They can live for hundreds, they could live for thousands of years. Because if you keep making clones, then you don't really have a lifespan. This sounds very science fiction, but you keep making clones, and basically your colony keeps surviving, even if individual older clones die. And so they can really live, these incredibly long lives, and yet they're so vulnerable in the world today. And I think that paradox was really intriguing to me, but also just the idea of that coral is alive. I think a lot of people I've been snorkeling with even don't quite realize that. I mean, you don't. There are no eyes to look at you. The fish and the turtles are a little more charismatic, maybe. Sorry, coral, but yeah. I think. I mean, they're incredibly important, and there's something just beautiful about like these tiny animals that thousands and thousands of them all together create something much larger than themselves. And I find that beautiful.
Yeah, and there's sort of this distinction that I think is important to make, that the actual coral itself is this living animal that is dynamic and, as you mentioned, sort of living in a colonial way, like living in colonies and sort of always continuing that life cycle and that growth, because it's very easy, we're anthropocentric beings. We're used to vertebrates, and we're used to thinking about, quote, animals as things that engage in sexual reproduction and things that can move and so, and not that coral can't move, but when we look at coral, I think a lot of people actually think that what I almost, it's probably not a good analogy, but I almost think of as like the quote bones of the coral,
Yes,
which is
no,
that,
it's good. Yeah.
right? Because our bones are also calcium. It's different. Our
Right.
bones are, I think, hydroxyapatite or some other like form of calcium. They're not calcium carbonate, but
Close enough.
that's and that's the thing that fossilizes, right? Like that's the
Hmm,
thing that
hmm.
is left over when somebody dies, just like when the coral dies, that's the thing that's left over. But the coral itself is not just that thing. It's not like there's all these living organisms on top of non-living coral. The coral itself is not just its quote bones.
Right, right. Not just his bones. And I wanted to clarify something though, because I mentioned the clones and the asexual reproduction, making those clones, and incredible process like that clearly we don't have. But corals are also, they do sexual reproduction, and one of the concerns is as a certain coral species shrink to very few individuals, that there won't be enough to form new genetic mixes, that through sexual reproduction. So most corals are spawners, so they release eggs and sperm into the water, and it needs to meet up with eggs and sperm from another of the same species. And if those corals are too far apart, if there aren't enough out there, then that's less likely to happen. And what's also, I think, interesting is that most corals that do spawn like that, they're releasing both eggs and sperm. There isn't a female coral and a male coral. They have both, and so there's this is very different than our anthropocentric way of thinking, and it also confers some advantages that scientists are picking up on, like the ability to help corals reproduce by getting the spawning corals near each other, or the spawn from the corals near each other, and that sort of thing, or helping to do it in the lab. And there's advantages to that way of life too.
Absolutely. And just to kind of, I guess, highlight what you said, or reiterate what you said for those who maybe don't remember their high school biology, if if all you're doing, like you're a plant that just propagates, or you're a bacterium that just buds off, or, if all you're doing is this sort of asexual reproduction, this cloning, you are just making more copies of yourself. Each copy might have more genetic, copying errors or mistakes. And definitely you're not increasing the genetic diversity. But through sexual reproduction, an organism over here that's the same species but wildly different genetically can quote mate, or can reproduce with an organism over there. And now all of a sudden the offspring are really richly diverse, right? And this is why, like, you don't want
Well,
to
this,
have, you don't
yeah,
want to mate with your brother. Like, it's like this is why it's really important that there's genetic diversity throughout the process, because then you're not going to end up with diseases and these things kind of sticking around.
well, that diversity too is what will hopefully help corals evolve. And I mean, of course, all species evolve over time. But in the case of corals evolving to have more heat tolerance is, of course, something that is very important. And if all the corals in a reef are the same genotypes, so the same genetic makeup, clones basically, if that genotype is not well adapted to dealing with heat, then it could be entirely wiped out. Whereas if you have a diversity of corals in that reef, and hopefully some with more heat tolerance than others, when there's a marine heat wave, hopefully that diversity will mean that some survive and go on to pass on their genetic material to the next generation. And so,
Are you
yeah.
describing Darwinian evolution right now?
Oh, I believe I waxed
I
into
believe
that.
you are.
Sorry.
No, I love it, I love it.
But,
I do think
the
it's
reason.
important. Yeah,
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
those of us who have, like, science degrees and who have spent a lot of time in academic science, we sort of take for granted that we have I don't wanna say a deeper, but a more nuanced understanding of what it means when people say, quote, "survival of the fittest," or what it means when we talk
Mhm,
about
mhm.
evolution through natural selection. But I sometimes worry that the way we represent these things in public discourse, not how we're representing it right now, but the way we see it in film and television, it's not the whole story, and so we get misled, and we think that somehow there's directionality to evolution or that there's a goal at the end of the line
Mhm.
because we're looking at
Yeah.
time backward, right? And so I love just taking the time sometimes to describe what it means to have an environmental pressure, what it means when we have enough diversity that some of the genetic material can withstand that environmental pressure and can live when the other things get wiped out and then continue to pass on. And eventually the whole population, has some form of that resilience, that gene that made them resilient. That's the only way anything will ever survive environmental pressures. And right now, the environmental pressures are outpacing the pace of evolution, and that's the crux of the problem, right? The oceans are getting warmer and more acidic and higher, like physically higher because of the warmth, but also because of ice melt, like glacial ice melt and ice melt from land ice. So, and that is causing pressure, like generational pressure, that's too fast for these organisms to evolve in lockstep with.
I mean, that's the question. We don't know. I mean, it does seem like the rate of change. I mean, this understanding rates of change, I think, is not easy. This is not something we encounter very often, but it's the pace of change is just so much faster than it was in the past. And so we know that in the past, corals have survived changes in temperature during ice age cycles, for instance. But those changes in temperature were not as rapid as what we're seeing now. So is there time? It's a good question, and there are conservationists and researchers that are trying to, can we help speed up this process? This is kind of, instead of natural selection, this is what do they call it? Artificial selection,
Artificial, yeah,
basically.
kind of like dog
Yeah,
breeding or making new strains of food, like choices that we make about
yeah.
how breeding happens in
So
order to
instead of
induce
making
those
dachshunds
changes.
long, we could make corals more heat tolerant, and so that there's I think they also call it now assisted evolution, that assisting this process. Now, will that work? We don't know for sure. There's so much we don't know for sure, but we don't know it won't work. And I think that that's an important thing that I came to as I was writing the book, is that there's so many unknowns, but one of the big unknowns is that we don't know that reefs are fated to fail. Like, that we don't know that it's too late to do anything. All of these efforts to help, um, they can have an impact. We just don't know. I think that not knowing, can bring up the what ifs in the middle of the night that we were talking about. what ifs could be, well, what if they survive? What if enough coral species survive that reefs can return? What if it works out? And I think that gives me some hope. And this is very long term hope. We're facing just decades of more corals being lost, more reefs being bleached in the heat. There are other problems that reefs are facing too. It's not just climate change. Lower water quality with runoff from cities, sewage getting into reefs, and fertilizers from agriculture, all sorts of other problems that coral reefs face too. But but yeah, we're facing decades of more problems. But in 50 years, in 100 years, in 400 years, will reefs be able to return? And there are things we can do now to help that, make sure that's possible. We have to be okay with the fact that we're not going to see the results of our labors. We're not going to see the end result of healthy reefs in a healthy world, but that future generations of humans would get to see that. And so that's a tough thing for our human brains to wrap around too, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you bring up so many important points. One of the things that came up for me in what you were just saying was this idea of artificial selection or guided evolution. What
Mhm.
decisions can we be making? I think about conventional breeding, and I sort of map those terms together. They're somewhat synonymous, but there's also even non-conventional breeding. There's, genetic engineering, and there's physical transplantation, like physically moving things from one area to another,
Mhm.
engineering
Mhm.
certain genes in a lab and then reinserting them somehow. Like we do have so many CRISPR. I mean, we have so many incredible tools at our disposal now that we didn't have even like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So we've got these different techniques that we're only starting to understand the possible impacts of them. But another thing that you mentioned are two things that I want to kind of highlight. Number one, it's not just warming. So I do want to kind of put a pin in that and get back to that. And number two, this very human, I'm a psychologist, so often I'm thinking about the human lens when it comes to these kind of global catastrophes and disasters. This very human tendency, which I believe is fundamentally tied to some of the problems with the way that we practice democracy and capitalism, which is what is the immediate impact of this thing, and what's the ROI, and how can we show the shareholders exactly how things are changing? And if I can't feel it overnight, or it doesn't get done in the next 4-year election cycle, I can't feel responsible for it. And it's like that we have to engage in a sea change. We have to engage in societal um, uh, grapplings with the fact that, just like you said, we may not even live to see. When we plant a seed, we may not live to see that mature tree. When we engage with these corals in a meaningful way, we may not know the outcomes. We might be dead by then, but our children and our children's children, and I say that with the royal hour 'cause I don't have kids,
Yeah,
but
I
I
don't
care
either.
about
But
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you don't have to have kids to care about this.
right, exactly.
You can
Uh,
still be invested in the future of humanity, even if you won't be there to observe it. But that concept requires saying it out loud and making it explicit, because it is not, I don't think, natural for most people to think that way.
yeah, I mean, one concern I have, that maybe you have some insight on from your, psychology, psychiatry sort of frame, is that we're going to see more and more headlines about dying corals, about all sorts of, environmental problems, about dying all sorts of things. And it'll look like it's too late, like we should give up
Yeah,
because,
that learned
um,
helplessness, kind of cynicism. We see it all the
yeah.
time with climate, writing and climate, like, it's like, "Ugh, everything sucks. I don't even wanna read about it anymore."
And I mean, this is sort of, I mean, the way I see it, this is a very geological way of seeing things, I think, but also somewhat human, is that we're in the middle of a crisis. And, there's the oceans are heating up, there's all these problems, we're in a global bleaching event. And when you're in the middle of any crisis, it can be really hard to have any perspective about, what the future would look like or could look like. And this is one reason that I turn to history, because history can give us some perspective. And that's, what I was doing in this book in part. But, if you're in the middle of a crisis, you're seeing kind of these worse things happening. But if you could be thinking about, well, how can I make it easier for reefs to bounce back? Or any insert ecosystem or human problem here. Like, how can I make it easier for X to bounce back from this? Like, knowing that there's going to be a low point, a point of crisis, and that we're kind of in it. Like, in several decades, how can we make sure that we haven't completely broken everything? Like, what can be salvaged so that there are some sorts of coral reefs in the future, or any sort of, how can we restore this? How can we? And maybe the past and the future don't look the same. Like, maybe coral reefs are not going to be the same in the future, in 100 years or 1,000 years or more, because we are in a mass extinction right now. We're going to lose species, but how can we save what we can so that there can be some ability to bounce back? And I think, that not seeing the fruits of our labors, it's tough. And I don't know if there's a work around it, but the ability to be in the middle of a crisis and try to envision what 100 years from now could be like, given that this crisis does exist. I think that that's really useful. But of course, you bring up the political cycles and the business kind of milestones and things like that. These things are not operating on the timescales that we need to be thinking about to solve some of these larger problems.
Yeah. No, it's overwhelming, but it's also manageable if we stop and we look at it kind of piece by piece. I'd love to talk, here. I know we're starting to run a little low on time, but we mentioned warming a lot, right? And this idea of bleaching. And I think we sort of take for granted because, yes, most everybody listening to the show, and if you've listened to the show, we've talked about this on the show before, you've heard the term coral bleaching. You know that the oceans getting warmer is very bad for the wildlife in the oceans. But let's maybe first kind of define what coral bleaching is, and then maybe let's talk about some of the other additional stressors that coral are under right now.
Absolutely. So coral bleaching happens when water heats up. Corals, I said they have a complex microbiome earlier, and one of the most interesting parts of that microbiome, some people think it's so different that maybe it's not a part of their microbiome, but is these symbiotic algae that live within the coral's tissues. So coral, as I mentioned, are animals, but they have these single-celled algae. They go by different names, but I like to call them zooxanthellae, because that's a fun word.
Yeah.
And the other names are Latin names, and they've changed recently somewhat. So I'll call them zooxanthellae. So the zooxanthellae, they get some assistance from the coral and the safe place to live inside the coral. Then they are able to do photosynthesis. So they're creating, photosynthesis produces sugars, which, is the food for plants. But the coral takes some of it too. So the coral is, and it's different with different species of corals, with different individual corals, but coral is getting, often half or even more than half of their nutrition from the products of photosynthesis. So they have their little zooxanthellae living within them, doing the photosynthesis, making these sugars through photosynthesis, and then the coral takes quite a bit of those sugars. And the zooxanthellae isn't harmed by this. It has more than enough to survive. So it's, kind of like sharing. But when water heats up, the zooxanthellae are kicked out of the coral's bodies, out of the coral's tissues. And there's different ideas about how this happens, but it's likely that the zooxanthellae, those algae, start producing some toxins inside the coral's bodies. And so then the coral kicks them out because having, these toxins within their bodies is not healthy. But without those little algae within them, they then are missing a huge source of their food. And corals also hunt, which is hard to imagine for an animal that is stuck to the seafloor, but they have little tentacles, and so they catch zooplankton floating by. So they they still have some sources of food. For most corals, they start to starve when they don't have those algae within them. So the water temperature heats up, the zooxanthellae get kicked out, and the corals look white. But what you're actually seeing is transparent corals because you're looking at their skeletons below them. And so those transparent corals are starving on the seafloor. They don't have enough food, and they're growing weak because of this. Now, if the water cools down, they can get zooxanthellae back inside their bodies, and they might be weakened for a while, but they can survive. And so a bleached coral is not a dead coral, but it's on the path. It's severely weakened. And so that's a main problem with heat in the oceans and how it's affecting coral. But there are these other problems too, and many of them started well before we were seeing mass coral bleaching events. Decades before that, like declines in water quality. For instance, when on a coast, when there's a lot of development and sediment runs off into the reefs near shore, that sediment gets all over the corals. And if you're a tiny coral with little tentacles, it's very hard to remove sand grains from you. So that can be a problem. And then as coastlines, as coastal communities grow, there's problems with runoff and sewage and agriculture, the nutrients in fertilizers, which are sort of chemically produced fertilizers, send tremendous amounts of nitrogen into the ocean, and so that might help you out if you're an algae growing that needs nitrogen, but it's not at all helpful if you're a coral that is adapted to very clear waters, and corals are adapted to live in, they're called oligotrophic waters, so that have very low nutrients and are very clear. And so the water quality issue seems to have started, at least in the Caribbean, decades before any evidence of mass coral bleaching. And then there's also coral diseases, which we know very little about, but they are likely tied to water quality problems and heat in the ocean, that these other factors make coral more vulnerable to disease, it now appears. And there's more to learn on that. And overfishing is also a problem in a lot of coral reefs. And coral reefs, because the ecosystem is so interconnected, the fish, and especially the grazing fish, are trimming down the algae levels in reefs, which creates more space for coral, or it can, if there are enough corals to fill that space. And so it's a complex system, and the problems it faces are complex too. But a lot of these problems are can be addressed on a local level, like the water quality issues and the fishing issues, and there are a lot of regulations about fishing, amounts of catch and reefs that are allowed, or if fishing is not allowed. There are new programs to build mangroves along coastlines that had been destroyed decades ago. These are those trees that grow with at their roots in the seawater, and they trap a lot of the runoff from land. So there are some problems that can be addressed at a local level, and then there's climate change, which is a global catastrophe, and really will take global action to get us there.
Of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, we're not just talking about sea level, the sea getting warmer, the level getting higher,
Hmm.
the water getting dirtier, the water getting more acidic.
Hmm.
Um, we're talking about things that, yeah, happen within the full ocean system, but also things that are happening sort of right off the coastline with local community effort that can be, if not reversed, mitigated with, I think, civic engagement, more pressure um, on our elected officials to ensure that we're acting. It's one of those tough things that I talk about with so many people on the show who have so many different areas of expertise. This like thinking globally and acting locally, and trying not to become cynical or engage in sort of that learned helplessness that we talked about. So, you know, help us a little bit, and you've already touched on it, but here towards the end of the show, help us a little bit with the counterpoints to that cynicism. Like, where do you find hope as somebody who spent quite a bit of your academic career researching these very problems and then continued by doing deep journalistic dives into this work and grappling with it and writing about it? How are you not depressed? How do you wake up every day, and how do you maintain that kind of hope?
Yeah. Well, okay. I think one thing that I've realized is it's okay to be sad. And, grief is going to be a part of this process, that, you can't ignore it. There are things to grieve. That's going to be a part of coping with all of this. One thing that I find so inspiring is all the people out there who are working to help, and who are, actively trying to find ways to save coral, to improve environments where reefs are. During the 2023 heat wave, I mean, it was in the Caribbean. It just it was terrifying. There was so much heat in Caribbean waters, and if you're a coral and you are attached to the seafloor, you have nowhere to run to. You are there, and there were all these efforts that I found really heartening in Florida to take the corals that had been grown for reef restoration. So these are corals grown from fragments that were going to be added to reefs, and save them. And these people came together from multiple organizations. They were trying to find ways to help. Still, there was a lot of coral lost, but it's amazing what people can do. And I think another thing that gives me some hope is that um, on the other side of the Caribbean, I talked to uh, this researcher, Lorenzo Alvarez Philip, from Mexico, who was seeing in one of the reefs that he had been studying for some time, there's all these corals that are all in the same hot water, and some of them were able to hold on to that zooxanthellae, were able to keep their color, and some of them were just completely pure white, that very bleached, and that there are these sort of pockets of areas where corals are surviving. They're not thriving necessarily, but the ocean is not uniform. So, it's not uniformly subject to exactly the same conditions. And animals are not uniform, and because of genetic diversity and evolution. But that there because of those differences, there are some that are able to survive. And so I think part of how I cope is to focus on, well, what is surviving and how can we help that process, and how that gives me some hope that it's not just everything's gone all of the time. It's okay, well, what made it? And why did that make it? And how can we help that happen more in the future? And I think that we all find our own coping strategies, but that focus on resilience has really helped me.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's such important framing. It's such an important perspective shift for those of us who have struggled to pinpoint that hope or to find it in some of the harder days. And so I really appreciate not just you sharing that insight with us, but all of these insights, all of this important information and knowledge in in a full length book. Everybody, the book is Reefs of Time: What Fossils Reveal About Coral Survival by Dr. Lisa S. Gardiner. Lisa, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kira.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.